East Berlin, the final resting place of Bertolt Brecht, essayist, poet, and playwright. His theory of the epic theater was to revolutionize dramatic practice in our century. He wrote, "I need no tombstone, but if you must make one for me, I would want it inscribed, 'He made suggestions. We followed them.'" He asked, how can the theater be both instructive and entertaining? How can it be divorced from spiritual drug traffic and turned from a home of illusions to a home of experiences? How can the unfree, ignorant man of our century, with his thirst for freedom and his hunger for knowledge, how can the tortured and heroic, abused and ingenious, changeable and world-changing man of this great and ghastly century obtain his own theater, which will help him to master the world and himself? He said, to think, to write or produce a play also means to transform society, to transform the state, to subject ideologies to close scrutiny. I grew up as the son of well-to-do people. My parents put a collar round my neck and taught me the habit of being waited on and the art of giving orders. But when I had grown up and looked around me, I disliked the people of my class, disliked giving orders and being waited on. And I left my own class and joined the common people. Thus they brought up a traitor, taught him their tricks, and he betrays them to the enemy. The city of Augsburg is 1 hour by train in a northwesterly direction from Munich. It was home to one of the most influential banking families in Europe, the Fuggers, who built model housing for low-income families in an earlier day. Here, on February 10, 1898, was born Eugen Bertolt Friedrich Brecht, later Bertolt Brecht, the son of a business executive who became manager of a paper factory. To illustrate Brecht's presumed early cunning, biographers tell the story of how the young high school pupil, who was weak in French, upgraded a French composition so that he would not have to repeat the class. He added to the teacher's red ink marks several more in places where there were no mistakes, then complained that he had been unjustly marked wrong. The confused teacher changed his grade. Later, the cocky author recalled, "Public school bored me for 4 years. During my subsequent confinement in high school, I did not succeed in improving my teachers substantially." When World War I broke out in August 1914, the 15-year-old boy, like most Germans, was seized by super-patriotism and war hysteria. He published his writings first in a school newspaper and then in an Augsburg paper. In these verses, for instance, he praises the mothers who, without lamenting and complaining, have seen their sons die, and he considers it a blessing that sacrifices are making his people stronger. The fledgling poet is intoxicated by war fever like everybody else around him. He signs his name Eugen Bertolt. In a few months, however, Brecht began to rethink his feelings about the war. He displays a new understanding and compassion in the poem Modern Legend, written when he was 16. Victory, defeat, battlefield, and mothers are again featured. But this time, the emphasis is on the mothers on both sides who are no longer war-intoxicated, but mourn their dead. When the evening blew over the battlefield, the enemies were beaten. The humming telegraph wires have carried the news everywhere. while the next two stanzas concentrate on cries for revenge by the defeated and jubilation among the victors. The poem ends with the telegraph wires again, this time announcing the dead on both sides. And see, both friends and enemies were silent. Only the mothers cried on both sides. 1 year later, 1915, the pupil Brecht, no longer a chauvinist, got into trouble in school because he mocked and ridiculed the then prevailing spirit of patriotism. In a composition about the famous line by Horace, Dulc et decor est pro patria mori, it is sweet and honorable to die for the fatherland, Brecht wrote that the sentence can only be valued as propaganda. Only fools would call dying an easy jump through the dark door, and they themselves would run away if they could. Only the intervention of an understanding teacher prevents Brecht's expulsion. Looking back, ironically, Brecht later said, "Wherever the mind was forcibly silenced, there resulted an absence of loud protest throughout the century." (1917) After graduating from secondary school, Brecht, by now convinced that he will be a writer or nothing, nevertheless enrolls as a student of medicine at the University of Munich. He starts writing his first play, Baal. He carouses nightly and plays in the band at a Munich cabaret where his favorite comedian, Karl Valentin, appears. But he misses his closest friend, the stage designer Caspar Neher, who serves as a soldier and rarely gets a furlough. Early in 1918, Brecht himself was inducted as a medical orderly and assigned to an Augsburg clinic. In November, he wrote the poem which made him famous. He called it Legend of the Dead Soldier. And when the fifth springtime of war no sign of peace brought forth, the soldier said, "You can go to hell," and died a hero's death. The medical commission trailed out to the little acre of God, and with sanctified spades they dug the fallen soldier out of the sod. The doctor looked him over well, or what was left to see. The doctor found he was okay, a shirking coward he. They took the soldier along with them. The night was blue and fine. You could, without a helmet on, have seen the stars of home.
Und sie nahmen sogleich den Soldaten mit, die Nacht war blau und schön. Man konnte, wenn man keinen Helm auf hat, die Sterne der Heimat sehen.
The owner of a Munich cabaret where Brecht himself recited the poem on stage remembers. During the legend of the dead soldier, the riot started. I had to lower the curtain. And Walter Mehring, another well-known satirist and colleague of Brecht, spoke the remarkable words, "Ladies and gentlemen, this was a great disgrace, not for the poet, but for you." Brecht mirrors the despair of a defeated Germany in the following poem. I confess it, I have no hope. The blind talk about a way out. I see. After all mistakes have been used up, our last companion will be nothingness. And in 1920, he notes in his diary that this Germany, meaning the early post-revolutionary Weimar Republic, bores him deeply. And he particularly deplores what he calls the degenerate peasantry, the fat middle class, and the feeble intellectuals. He still commutes between Munich, where he works on his first two plays, and Augsburg, where he writes reviews of local theatrical productions for a newspaper. He establishes a growing reputation as an enfant terrible, both in terms of a wild lifestyle as well as extreme and anarchic views on life, society, and art. Some of his reviews are devastating attacks on traditionally revered dramatists of the 19th century and on local stage directors and actors. He is finally sued by the Augsburg theater management and has to settle for a substantial fine. His father, who still supports his son's literary ambitions, pays the fine. Brecht is unrepentant. I stand by my views, he declares. Nothing better describes the brash poet-dramatist Brecht in his early 20s than the literary portrait he provided in his first play, Baal. Accordingly, his young god is chaotic, lyrical, tender, despairing, as well as cruel, egotistical, and cynical. And the sky was there in joy and misery, even when Baal slept or had no eyes to see. Nights meant violet sky and drunken Baal. Dawns, Baal innocent, sky apricot pale. Once a woman, Baal says, gives her all, leave her. That's as far as she can go. Other men should represent no risk at all. Even Baal is scared of babies, though. In January of 1919, Brecht wrote the first version of his second play, originally called Spartacus, and dealing with riot and strike-torn Berlin during the preceding winter. Leon Feuchtwanger was enthusiastic about its dramatic effectiveness and satirical treatment of the German bourgeoisie. His wife suggested the final title, Drums in the Night. He vividly remembered the Brecht who appeared in his Munich apartment. A very young man, slim, poorly shaven, unkempt in his clothing. It took more than 3 years until Drums in the Night opened to sensational reviews in Munich on September 29, 1922. How cynical and anti-romantic Brecht was can be seen in his displaying posters on stage with inscriptions like, "Every man for himself," and "Don't stare so romantically." Not only was Brecht's play a great success in Munich, but it made the 24-year-old author a national celebrity. His self-promotion helped the process. On one of his visits to Berlin, he had persuaded Germany's most influential theater critic to attend the Munich premiere. It was not the political content that impressed the critic, but Brecht's use of new idiomatic dialogue that seemed to have an almost hypnotic effect on the audience. That the same Brecht was also a master of traditional and even romantic lyricism can be seen in one of his most beautiful love poems, composed 2 years earlier during a train ride to Berlin. It is titled, Memory of Marie A. Upon that day, a day of blue September, silent and still beneath a young plum tree, I held my silent, still, and pale beloved, and in my arms a golden dream was she. And in the wide and lovely summer heavens there was a cloud, and long I saw it there. It was pure white, and oh so high above us. When I looked up, it vanished in the air. And since that moment many a September came sailing in, then floated down the stream. No doubt the plum trees were cut down for timber, and if you ask what happened to my dream, I shall reply, I cannot now remember. Though what you have in mind I surely know. And yet her face, I really don't recall it. I just recall I kissed it long ago.
So sag ich dir, ich kann mich nicht erinnern. Und doch gewiss, ich weiß schon, was du meinst. Doch ihr Gesicht, das weiß ich wirklich nimmer. Ich weiß nur mehr, ich küsste es dereinst.
Now a Berliner in spirit, Brecht threw himself with gusto into the many activities of the city. Berlin is the first metropolis he has ever known. The city's frantic pace is a spur to his own creativity. He wonders how he, a man from provincial Augsburg, with a certain talent to see the world and write about it, ever got into this kind of marketplace with cafes and amusement joints and the types of people who frequent them. Observing audiences at boxing matches and bicycle races in the big sports palace, he feels that the traditional theater is obsolete. A sharper, direct presentation of the dangerous modern world is urgently needed. He befriends another enfant terrible, a young radical expressionist playwright whom he talks into letting him direct his new play, Murder of a Father. In his memoirs, the dramatist describes how the inexperienced Brecht dealt with the two leading actors, who happened to be among the most famous stars of the German theater. The thin little man from Augsburg looked up at the rather corpulent big man and woman on the stage and said to them, articulating coolly and precisely, that everything that they had been doing was baloney. After the angry leading man had thrown his script into the audience and the sobbing woman actress had left the stage, meaning after the two famous stars had withdrawn from the play, Brecht sarcastically consoled his friend with the words, "They would never have been able to do it well anyhow." Ever since his early poetry, Brecht had been drawn to the ballads of Rudyard Kipling with their praise of strong and adventurous men. It now occurred to him that the equivalent of Kipling's jungle of nature might well be the jungle of a big city like Berlin. As a voracious reader, Brecht was also familiar with American novelists like Jack London and Upton Sinclair, who had so vividly described the jungle of Chicago's slaughterhouses. Brecht's next play, In the Jungle of the Cities, produced in 1923, shocked Munich theatergoers. It can be judged as one of the few early acknowledgments by a German writer that urban man and urban life must become central themes of 20th century literature. In 1923, however, audiences wouldn't buy it. Just as Baal, finally produced by a theater in Leipzig, transformed the first night audience into a yelling and angrily hissing mob. A Berlin drama critic, however, saw past these failures. "The 24-year-old Brecht," he wrote, "has changed forever the way we look at the theater and its possibilities for rendering the real world." In 1924, Max Reinhardt offered Brecht a job as a literary assistant at his theater. It enabled Brecht, newly married and the father of a daughter, to move to Berlin permanently. The publication of his earlier poetry, under the title Manual of Piety, 1927, made him the recognized new lyrical voice in literary circles. He was still without a firm political platform, somewhat anarchic, anti-bourgeois, and pro-little man. The industrial and financial operations of the modern world fascinated him. In the machinery of commerce, he saw keys to an understanding of the way life worked. While researching the workings of the wheat market, he read Karl Marx for the first time. He was impressed and enrolled in a class on Marxism in a Berlin adult evening school. He was intrigued by the writings of the young Marx and the latter's indebtedness to his beloved philosopher Hegel. Brecht's familiarity with street ballads and his sympathy for the raffish ways of the underworld led to his first great popular success during this period. The Threepenny Opera is still the work by which he is best known throughout the world today. The first performance took place on August 31, 1928, in Berlin. The stage set was designed by his old friend, Caspar Neher. The racing music was composed by his friend Kurt Weill. The play adapts John Gay's 18th century English musical to the cutthroat world of Edwardian London. The audience had no difficulty in recognizing parallels to the gangsterism and police corruption of Berlin in 1928. Examples: "Now all you gentlemen who wish to lead us, who teach us to desist from mortal sin, your prior obligation is to feed us. When we've had lunch, your preaching can begin." Or when Jenny the prostitute sings, "You who insist upon your pleasure and our shame, take note of this one thing, for it is late. Your fine philosophy, good sirs, you may proclaim, but till you feed us, right and wrong can wait." When Brecht had his gangster Mac the Knife ask, "Or is it only those who have the money can enter in the land of milk and honey?" The answer he himself then gives is characteristic for an author who is still more despairing, anarchic, nihilistic, and philosophically pessimistic than a conforming Marxist. What does a man live by? By resolutely ill-treating, beating, cheating, eating some other bloke. A man can only live by absolutely forgetting he's a man like other folk.
Vergessen kann, dass ein Mensch doch ist.
The success of the Threepenny Opera made Brecht prosperous for the first time. Here we see Brecht with his second wife, the actress Helena Weigel, and his toddler son Stefan. Brecht submitted to home movies, but his mind was elsewhere, balancing numerous projects. His constant companion was the composer Kurt Weill and his wife Lotte Lenya, who portrayed Jenny in the Threepenny Opera. An incident of police brutality may have quickened Brecht's sympathy for organized labor. From the window of his apartment, Brecht saw police fire into a demonstration of unarmed workers. It was Labor Day, May 1st, 1929. Many men fell down. There was blood, and the wounded were carried away. I have never seen Brecht so white-faced before, his teacher at the adult school wrote later, and added, I think that it was mainly this experience that drove him closer and closer to the communists. Brecht never seems to have joined the party. The leading communist newspaper in Berlin still considered him merely a bourgeois sympathizer. But it is true that he now made conscious efforts to adjust his writing style to a new, unadorned simplicity, which, he hoped, would make it easier for the less educated people of the working class to grasp his message. The teacher in him, and he remained one until his death, impelled him to write short didactic plays which did not need elaborate staging or trained actors, but might be performed by students and workers in school auditoriums, union halls, and factories. Brecht wrote, "These plays must be performed only by those who have use for them, worker choirs, non-professional theater groups, that is, by those who neither pay for art nor are being paid for it, but wish to create art." In contrast to the German theater of pompous rhetoric, Brecht reasserted an earlier tradition of clowns, jugglers, and street musicians, a theater of coarse, vivid language with the rhythms of common speech, of banal words in imaginative settings. He said, "In our theater, modern man is becoming a fossil, a blockhead, who can no longer distinguish between his own interests and those of his enemies." At a time when he was not yet a Marxist, he saw in modern man a new, more ritualized behavior, an erosion of individual differences. In Brecht's comedy, A Man is a Man, the hero is a good-natured dock worker in India. Finding himself in the British colonial army by mistake, he is converted into a bloodthirsty killer by his fellow soldiers. A Man is a Man demonstrates Brecht's didactic method. In showing how malleable men can be, he foreshadows the brainwashing techniques practiced by dictatorships on a systematic scale. In his search for new techniques, Brecht took part in an experimental film based on A Man is a Man. He pursued new ways of making theater audiences intellectually more alert while counteracting emotional over-involvement. In Brecht's view, the spectator should never lose him or herself completely in the action on stage, but should always remain aware that the action is taking place in a theater. The spectator must always ask, do things have to be like this? Or could the character in a particular situation behave differently? Brecht wants to keep the audience from emotional absorption in the stage action. Therefore, he uses disruptive new devices, posters, film clips, commentators on or in front of the stage, flashbacks, musical interludes. The epic theater sees man as an instrument of social forces and seeks to shock the audience into recognizing its power to alter circumstances. Brecht borrowed the term epic theater from the revolutionary stage director Erwin Piscator. His notes to The Rise and Fall of Mahagoni, the opera he wrote in 1930 with composer Kurt Weill, contain Brecht's first explicit exposition of his theory. Brecht's last play before Hitler came to power was The Mother, a dramatization of the novel of the same title by Maxim Gorky. There is general agreement that Brecht came closest to being a communist writer with this work. Although approved by the party more than other Brechtian efforts, it has never attained unqualified praise or popularity in the Soviet Union, and is often slighted as a piece of propaganda by Western critics. Here we see Helene Weigel in a production by Brecht's famous Berliner Ensemble 25 years later. She is about to carry the flag at a forbidden street demonstration.
Die Fahne lag neben ihm. Da bückte sich unsere Pelageja Vlasova, die ruhige, gleichmütige, die Genossin, und griff nach der Fahne.
Gib die Fahne her, Smilgin, sagte ich. Gib sie nur her. Ich werde sie schon tragen. Das wird alles noch anders werden.
3 years after the Berlin premiere, Theater Union in New York gave a number of English performances. Brecht, then living in Denmark, made his first American trip to attend the rehearsals and the opening. It became a disaster in every respect. Brecht not only objected to the translation, the way his play had been adapted, the staging and acting style, but his collaborator, the composer Hans Eisler, also condemned the arrangement of the musical score. In those years, the prevailing model for directors and actors on Broadway was Stanislavski, whose extreme naturalism was hostile to the stylizing tendencies of Brecht's new epic theater. Finally, the yelling and interrupting dramatist and his musical collaborator were literally thrown out of the theater. 1 year later, in 1931, the two men collaborated on a feature film, the first time that Brecht tried to write a script for this medium. Set in a proletarian milieu in and near Berlin, Kühle Wampe extolled working-class solidarity and outraged right-wing officials. The dialogue discusses, in an ironical and satirical fashion, what would happen if Germany still had colonies and could produce coffee. Should or would the price of coffee then go down? It seems that this would depend on whose interest is at stake, farmhands or factory workers or storekeepers or consumers and so on. You, sir, will not change the world, and this lady here also will not change the world, and the gentleman there also not, and an impartial, that is, non-committed person like you even less. And this gentleman here will also not change the world because he likes it the way it is. And who will change the world? Those who do not like it.
Und dieser Herr hier, der wird die Welt auch nicht ändern. Dem gefällt sie ja so, wie sie ist. Und wer wird sie ändern?
Die, denen sie nicht gefällt.
January 1933. Hitler is appointed Reichschancellor. The Nazis come to power. Brecht, aware that his name is prominent on all Nazi blacklists, starts preparing his flight. On February 27, 1933, the huge building of the German parliament, the Reichstag, is set on fire. The communists are accused of arson, but it is generally assumed that the Nazis did it in order to issue emergency laws for the arrest of enemies of the regime. Brecht leaves Germany with his family. In December of 1933, Brecht and his family settle near the city of Svendborg on the Danish island of Funen in a farmhouse, which becomes his home for 6 years, with occasional short stays in Paris and London. With the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War in 1936, Brecht quickly wrote a one-act play in support of the Spanish Republican cause. Senora Carrar's Rifles starred Helene Weigel and was an immediate success. The play is an updated and politicized version of the Irish one-act play Riders to the Sea by J.W. Singh. The heroine, who has lost her Andalusian fisherman husband in the Civil War, is determined to keep her two sons out of the fighting. At the end, however, Teresa Carrar not only hands over rifles she has hidden in the house, but leaves for the front herself. Senora Carrar's Rifles is written in what Brecht called the style of the Aristotelian theater, that is, in a straightforward traditional manner with unity of action, time, and place. In this poem, Brecht describes how Helena Weigel prepares for her role as Senora Carrar in the dressing room. She sits in front of a mirror and makes up her face, which will later show changes even the slightest feeling will affect. She is already wearing the coarse blouse with the patch sleeve. Her shoes made of rope are still on the table. Then she asks whether they have brought the big drum which is needed to suggest gun warfare, and whether the big fishing net is in its place. And Brecht continues. Then she gets up, tiny figure but great fighter, to step into the rope-soled shoes and to represent the fight of the Andalusian fisherwoman against the generals. In the meantime, the Nazi press and radio incite the public and the Danish government against Brecht by presenting him as a Jew, blasphemer, and communist whose last opus German refugees have just produced in Copenhagen. Refugee Bert Brecht, still not expelled. We now show a photo of Brecht as the small farmer he pretends to be. The farm is neglected because the Jewish communistic criminal and emigrant Brecht has, of course, other things to do than to work in agriculture. Here we see Brecht making notes in his work journal about current events, inserting photos, and working on literary projects. In 1938, Brecht begins to write scenes for his Terror and Misery of the Third Reich, which later became The Private Life of the Master Race, in the translation by Eric Bentley in the United States. Brecht feverishly composed poetry and worked on various dramatic projects. Hans Eisler, who often visited him in Denmark, collaborated on some of them. Brecht and Eisler lived in a state of apprehension and tension, relieved only by their will to endure. We not only believed in ourselves, but in our cause. Nothing spoke for us except our insight into the development of the times to come. In 1938, Hitler annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia, and Chamberlain came to Munich for peace in our time. Hitler rambled on. We need for our great plans more than just peace, as we could do justice to our tasks only by re-establishing social peace. So we can only realize our great projects by preserving peace in Europe. I do not think it necessary to put to the test the fame of the National Socialist movement or of the German army. Brecht understands the threat behind these speeches, and he calls Hitler the house painter, referring to the Führer's early pseudo-artistic past. He wrote, "And in reality, the house painter is about to conquer the world. The big German maneuvers started yesterday. In other words, a rehearsal for mobilization." Looking at the water, he comments on how quickly the Germans could come. Down the bay the ferry boats go by. The house has 4 doors through which to flee. Anticipating the German occupation of Denmark, Brecht and his family moved to Sweden in April of 1939. They settle on the little suburban island of Liding near Stockholm. Brecht is plagued by nightmares in which he dreams of an imminent attack and occupation by German troops. In a poem, he says, "I was in a city and discovered that the street signs and names were in German. Soaking wet, I woke up, and with relief, I saw the pitch-dark ferry outside through the window, and then I knew I was in a foreign country." Shortly before the war, Brecht hears on the radio that Germany has warned all neutral countries not to fly over Polish territory. And a few days later, on September 9, 1939, the news comes that the Germans have invaded Poland. Despite his acute sense of danger as a stateless political fugitive, Brecht's output continues at a hectic pace. During the first 3 months of the war, in the fall of 1939, he writes the play that becomes a testament to human endurance throughout history, Mother Courage and Her Children. When the invasion of Denmark and Norway finally takes place in April of 1940, the Nazis brag with straight faces. For the protection of Norwegian and Danish neutrality, German troops have landed in numerous harbors of these countries, an unparalleled achievement in the history of naval warfare. Fearing a German invasion of Sweden, the Brecht family flees again and sails to Helsinki. Brecht finishes The Good Woman of Szechuan, another of his master plays. He is entirely dependent on the hospitality of strangers, and he is not at all sure when he will have to flee still farther away, as his poem expresses. Fleeing my countrymen, I have now reached Finland. Friends whom I did not know yesterday place some beds into clean rooms. Over the radio I hear victory announcements by the scum. With curiosity, I am looking at the map of the hemisphere. High above, in Lapland, near the Arctic Ocean, I still see a narrow door. He dramatizes a long, humorous story by his host about a rich, alcoholic, good-natured landowner. The result is a farcical comedy, Mr. Puntilla and His Servant Matti, one of Brecht's best plays. Throughout World War II, Brecht collects war photos and writes short poems about them, later publishing them as a book under the title German War Primer. In his work journals, published after his death, Brecht comments on the strange discrepancy between what is going on around him, namely the war, and what he is writing about, the adventures of an unimportant farmer of the past. He notes, "The story of Puntilla hardly concerns me at all. The war, however, completely. About Puntilla, I am able to write almost everything. About the war, nothing." It is interesting how remote from the all-decisive happenings can be the practice of literature. Brecht here characterizes his own way of writing, probably without being aware of it. He always needed to distance his subjects for the purpose of stylization and alienation demanded by his epic theater. All his masterpieces deal with mythical or legendary or historical characters in fairy tale or oriental settings. His short poems, however, often reflect an immediate reality. In this poem, he admonishes a woman to stop looking for dead war victims under the rubble, and to stop accusing fate, because undefined dark powers are not responsible for her loss, but real persons who have names, addresses, and human faces. Waiting in Helsinki for an American visa, Brecht notes in his diary an old idea for a gangster play: to recall certain events and faces which we all know. The result is The Resistible Rise of Arturo Ui. Written during March and April of 1941, the play presents Hitler as a Chicago gangster controlling the Cauliflower Trust. Also involved in the plot are President Hindenburg and Austrian Chancellor Dollfuss. Considering the extremely precarious situation in which Brecht found himself, stateless, moneyless, in a foreign city whose language he could not speak, in the middle of a war, still without a visa, and at best hoping to reach America by way of a dangerous boat trip, it is amazing that he still remained full of humor and irony. In his Conversations Among Refugees, he has two men who have fled Germany discuss the overriding importance of a passport. The passport is the noblest part of a human being. It is also not produced in the simple way a human being is made. A human being can be made everywhere, in the most careless manner, and without an intelligent reason. But a passport? Never. Consequently, it will be recognized provided it is a good one, while even the best man may not be recognized. On May 2nd, 1941, the Brecht family finally received American visas. They traveled to Leningrad and then to Moscow. After a short stay, they continued the long journey overland on the Trans-Siberian Express to Vladivostok. Here they booked passage on a freighter to California. The Brechts arrived in San Pedro Harbor, Los Angeles, July 21, 1941, and settled near Hollywood. He tries to sell film scripts, mostly without success. One, Hang Men Also Die, finally reaches the screen, directed by Fritz Lang. Brecht is bitter about life in Hollywood. Each morning, to earn my livelihood, I go to the market where lies are being bought. Full of hope, I join the row of the sellers. In these years, Brecht writes two of his finest plays, The Caucasian Chalk Circle and Schweik in the Second World War, based on one of his favorite literary characters. Schweik, the sad sack soldier, figured in an earlier Brecht play in the 1920s in Berlin. Occasionally, Brecht is unable to work and nervously awaits the outcome of an important event, as in this picture, awaiting news about the Battle of Smolensk. He is relieved when America enters the war. Sometimes he is torn between elation over the deeds of the British RAF and the horrible results of the bombing of German cities like Cologne. At times, Brecht tries to imagine how the Germans would feel, as in this poem. You, in the tanks and airplanes with bombs, great warriors, who are sweating in Algiers and freezing in Lapland, and come from 100 battles as the victors. It is us you have defeated. You are triumphant. As the war nears its end, Brecht becomes active in forming a Committee for a Free Germany. In New York, he discusses with fellow refugee intellectuals like Thomas Mann a Council for a Democratic Germany. Brecht now renewed his hopes for an American production of one of his major plays, something he had not experienced since leaving Berlin. He began collaborating on a translation of Galileo with the actor Charles Laughton, next to Chaplin, the only foreigner in his Hollywood circle who was not a German refugee. Brecht had come to believe that science more and more dominates modern man, and that we are all now children of a scientific age. The dropping of the atom bomb over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 shocked him deeply. Brecht now changed his hero into a man who betrayed science, although he could have become the man who gave it a moral credo, similar to the Hippocratic Oath in medicine. Praised by a pupil for recanting so that he can secretly go on doing research, Galileo accuses himself in the strongest terms. I surrendered my knowledge to the powers that be. To use it? No, not use it. Abuse it as it suits their ends. I have betrayed my profession. Any man who does what I have done must not be tolerated in the ranks of science. Galileo opened in Beverly Hills in 1947. Brecht's friends were there to applaud, but its reception was lukewarm. Brecht was planning to return to Europe when he was summoned by a congressional committee investigating alleged communist activities in Hollywood. With tongue-in-cheek, he played the good soldier Schweik, answered questions with his customary irony, and was thanked for his cooperation. Returning, he went first to Zurich, where his plays had been performed during the war years, and he wondered about his reception in Germany in this poem. The city of my fathers, how can I find it? Following the swarms of bombers, I come home. Where does it lie? Yonder, where huge mountains of smoke arise. There, in the flames, it stands. The city of my fathers, how will it receive me? Brecht and his wife, Helene Weigel, returned to East Berlin in the fall of 1948 to establish their own repertory theater group. It became the Berliner Ensemble. The first German production of Mother Courage and Her Children takes place in the old German Theater in East Berlin. It is a triumphant success for both the author and Weigel. Her portrayal of Mother Courage in the 30 Years' War epitomizes the spirit of human survival. Here's Mother Courage and her wagon. Hey, Captain, let them come and buy beer by the keg, wine by the flagon. Let your men drink before they die. Sabers and swords are hard to swallow. First you must give them beer to drink. Then they can face what is to follow. But let 'em swim before they sink. Christians awake, the winter's gone, the snows depart, the dead sleep on. And though you may not long survive, get out of bed and look alive. The design and staging of Mother Courage offers a model for the future productions of the Berliner Ensemble. Weigel is named director of the ensemble, and Brecht its artistic head. The ensemble was conceived as a political theater. As such, it became the testing ground for the theories formulated by Brecht in a short organum for the theater, which he wrote in Zurich in 1948. He observes, "Man does not have to stay the way he is now, nor does he have to be seen only as he is now, but also as he might become. We must not start with him. We must start on him. This means, however, that I must not simply set myself in his place, but must set myself facing him to represent us all. That is why the theater must alienate what it shows." Brecht and Weigel succeed in building a remarkable ensemble of actors, directors, designers, and stagehands. They enjoy the luxury of long rehearsals. Brecht uses the Socratic method in working out scenes with his actors. He asks questions as he proceeds. He wants actors to make discoveries as they read and rehearse. Brecht reminds his company, "It is impossible to complete a play without the help of the stage, because the stage alone is the decisive factor for trying out suitable variations." Brecht's and his wife's intense, never-ending labors in the theater are not only recognized in East Germany. The Berliner Ensemble becomes known throughout Europe as the finest German-speaking theater. The tremendous success of Mother Courage with Helene Weigel at the Theatre of Nations in Paris in June 1954 provides the capstone to the ensemble's reputation. In March of 1954, the Berliner Ensemble moves into a home of its own. It is the refurbished old Theater am Schiffbauerdamm, where Threepenny Opera had its premiere in 1928. The enfant terrible has become what he has always scorned, an elder statesman heaped with honors. The failure of Galileo had obsessed Brecht since its production by Charles Laughton. For Brecht, Galileo was the embodiment of man's predicament in the nuclear age. Now Brecht attempted a new production. Galileo bespeaks the author's passionate belief in man when he says, "For 2,000 years, mankind believed that the sun and all the stars of heaven revolved around them. The Pope, the cardinals, the princes, the scholars, captains, merchants, fishwives, and school children believed that they sat motionless on this crystal globe. But now we are off on a vast journey, for the old time is gone, and this is a new time. For 100 years, it seems, people have been waiting for something." Ill and tired, he appeared for a rehearsal for the last time on August 10th, 1956. 4 days later, Bertolt Brecht was dead. Here, in his own voice, is part of his poem, To Posterity.
In die Städte kam ich zur Zeit der Unordnung, als da Hunger herrschte. Unter die Menschen kam ich zur Zeit des Aufruhrs, und ich empörte mich mit ihnen. So verging meine Zeit, die auf Erden mir gegeben war.
I came to the cities in a time of disorder, when hunger ruled. I came among men in a time of uprising, and I revolted with them. So the time passed away which on earth was given to me. For we knew only too well, even the hatred of squalor makes the brow go stern. Even anger against injustice makes the voice grow harsh. Alas, we who wish to lay the foundation of kindness could not ourselves be kind. But you, when at last it comes to pass that man can help his fellow man, do not judge us too harshly.
Ihr aber, wenn es so weit sein wird, dass der Mensch dem Menschen ein Helfer ist, gedenkt unserer mit Nachsicht.
Ihr Herren, die ihr uns lehrt, wie man brav leben und Sünd und Missetat vermeiden kann. Zuerst müsst ihr uns was zu fressen geben, dann könnt ihr reden, damit fängt es an. Ihr, die ihr euren Wanz und unsere Bravheit liebt, das eine wisset ein für allemal, wie ihr es immer dreht und wie ihr es immer schiebt. Erst kommt das Fressen, dann kommt die Moral. Erst muss es möglich sein.